This is Scottish Murders, and I'm your host, Dawn. This week's episode is not what I thought it was going to be. I said that this episode would be all about Pat McAdam's potential murderer, intermingled with the continuing leads, false hope, and investigation into Pat McAdam's disappearance. But I've decided to leave telling you all about Pat's potential murderer until the next episode. I just wanted to finish up telling you about Pat's story. Well, to be fair, in my opinion, what happens from now on isn't altogether focused on Pat per se. There's someone else that took the limelight from here on in, albeit it does help to keep Pat's case in the newspapers for decades. And to this day, Pat's case is still held in great regard by a certain group of people. But I'll get to that. So, let's get into today's episode. So I ended part 1 in 1969 with a lorry driver who had given Pat and her friend Hazel a lift home from Glasgow and who had been the last person to see Pat alive, having been questioned numerous times and released without charge, due to there being no forensic evidence and Pat's body not having been found, and a potential sighting of Pat in Leeds by a friend coming to nothing. But we've barely scratched the surface with this investigation, although not all the investigating was being done by the police. Now, I mentioned in part 1 about a particular reporter who, I felt, did a fantastic job at keeping Pat's case in the public eye from 1967 to 1987 by thinking outside the box, and not by harassing Pat's family or trying to sensationalise the case. His name was Frank Ryan, and he was a reporter for the Daily Record. The amount of articles I found written by Frank Ryan at the time Pat first disappeared and continually throughout his whole career was incredible. So it appears that Frank Ryan really couldn't let this case go as the investigation into Pat's disappearance began to slow down, with all leads having been exhausted. You hear about police officers having a case they can't forget and still work on or think about after they retire. Well, it appears that Pat McAdam's disappearance was that case for Frank. And so in early February 1970, Frank flew to Holland to speak to Clairvoyant Gerard Croiset, described as, according to an article written by Frank Ryan in the Daily Record on the 16th of February 1970, the miracle man of Holland, the Dutch man with the X-ray mind, and the man who mystifies Europe. Some pretty impressive accolades there. So before we find out what Gerard Croiset said in relation to Pat McAdam's disappearance that changed Frank Ryan's mind from skeptic to believer, let's find out just who Gerard Croiset is. I, too, am a skeptic, by the way. Gerard grew up in a small town in Holland, becoming a grocery clerk in the same small town until 1946, when he was 36 years old, when he was discovered by a professor and director of Parapsychology Institute at Utrecht University, who guided and encouraged Gerard to use his strange gifts, being, according to the same article, a sixth sense, a psychic power, or having a mind that sees through time and space. So this professor guided Gerard and his gift over the years, apparently leading to Gerard to help police in many parts of Europe and in America find hidden bodies, solve murders and crimes, as well as helping those closer to home find missing documents and valuables. So quite a varied set of skills there. The article did go on to say, though, that Gerard's ESP powers can be quite elusive and spontaneous, and unlike the 5 known senses, these ESP powers cannot be controlled. Gerard said in the article with a shrug that, "They just come naturally to me. Some days he sees things and other days he doesn't, but when it does come, the results are quite remarkable." Okay, so I thought I'd have a wee look at what cases Gerard's helped police with and what his success rate was like. Now, I didn't do a big deep dive search, I just asked ChatGPT to see what it could find. So, according to ChatGPT, some of the most notable cases Gerard was asked to help with included the Beaumont children's disappearance in Australia in 1966. Okay, so I know that case, but I didn't think there had been a resolution. Maybe I was wrong. No, I wasn't. The outcome of Gerard's help was that his sightings didn't lead to any discoveries. Okay, so another case he apparently worked on was the kidnapping of Muriel Mackay in the UK in 1970. Apparently, Gerard claimed that Muriel was in a white farmhouse near an abandoned aerodrome, saying that if she wasn't found within 14 days, she would die. Muriel's body was never found, but her two brothers were later convicted of her murder. Okay, so another bust. What else? Well, in 1973 in Wales, Sandra Newton, Geraldine Hughes and Pauline Floyd were murdered, with the murders being known as the Steel Town murders. The South Wales police brought in Gerard after the investigation stalled, but again his involvement led absolutely nowhere, the case eventually being solved decades later using familial DNA. It was also mentioned that Gerard helped American police too to solve crimes, so again I asked ChatGPT for a list of these. But apparently, while he claimed in his biography that he helped solve some of the century's most spectacular crimes, including in the US, it was apparently hard to find a direct impact to the solving of American crimes to Gerard's involvement, with any claims being met with skepticism and lacking rigorous documentation. American law enforcement and the FBI did call on Gerard Croiset when they had run out of options, or if it was a high-profile case, especially missing persons cases, but his success rate was apparently never conclusively proven to be better than chance. So, a bit disappointing. I was expecting quite remarkable proven results. Okay, well, whatever Gerard Croiset said about Pat's disappearance must have been pretty remarkable if it turned skeptic Frank Ryan into a believer. So let's find out what he had to say. According to an article in the Daily Record on the 16th of February 1970 written by Frank Ryan, in early February 1970, Frank had flown to Amsterdam and met with Gerard Croiset at his home in Utrecht, which is about 20 minutes from Amsterdam, and a home he shared with his wife and 5 children. Once there, and the men having been introduced via an interpreter, Frank showed Gerard a photograph of Pat, which had been taken a week before she went missing. Gerard then requested to see on a map the area where Pat had last been seen on a lorry after Hazel had been dropped off in Annan, and Frank happily obliged. Following Frank pointing this area out, Gerard then apparently stared at Frank, took several deep breaths and said, via the interpreter, "I see a transport cafe. I also see a flat bridge, greyish in colour, at the foot of a hill. It is over a river and has tubular railings. There is a bend in the railings." As Gerard spoke, he also drew sketches, going on to say that near this bridge is a converted cottage. It's used for different purposes. There are advertising signs on it. He also said that there was a white wooden paling fence close to the cottage, and a small path nearby to the right of the cottage. Gerard ended by saying that she is dead and buried, not too far from the area where she was last seen, and that the girl is buried in a sort of cave beneath the roots of a tree along this path. However, in order to give more accurate information, Gerard requested that Frank fly back to Scotland and locate the area he had described, take photos and bring them back to him, after which Gerard promised to supply more detailed information. Still sceptical, but feeling slightly buoyed by what Gerard had to say, Frank, along with a Daily Record photographer, travelled to the one bridge that Frank knew in the area to see what Gerard had described. But alas, no, neither the bridge or the area matched Gerard's sketchings. However, the photographer said that he knew of another bridge about 3 miles away, and so the pair travelled to this bridge, and they were stunned to find not only a grey bridge at the foot of a hill over a river, just as Gerard had described, but also about a few hundred yards or metres from the bridge was a cottage that has since been converted into an office store and was owned by a building firm, which also had advertising boards on 2 of its walls, and a white wooden paling fence in front. Bingo. They had found the spot Gerard had described and sketched. And so, with photos taken of the area, and now less sceptical Frank returned once again to Gerard's office and excitedly handed over the photos to him, at which point Gerard exclaimed, "This is what I saw." Frank then showed Gerard exactly where the landmarks he described were on a map. Gerard then sketched the winding river, the River Milk, that flowed under the bridge and said, "I see a lake. You must look for a bend in the river near here. There is a house nearby. Under the roots of a tree you will find something belonging to the girl, a female garment." Gerard then said, "You will find part of a car and a wheelbarrow near the spot, but they have nothing to do with the case." He then marked an X on the map where the car and wheelbarrow would be found. He ended by saying that this could also be where they would find the body of the girl. Frank left Gerard's office again and flew back to Scotland, his scepticism decreasing more and more. And on Saturday the 14th of February, Frank, along with his wife and an independent witness, walked along the banks of the River Milk, and Frank couldn't believe his eyes when he discovered an old, broken-down car, minus its wheels, with a wheelbarrow propped up against it, near a cottage, only yards or metres from where Gerard had placed the X on the map. Frank then scanned the riverbank, noticing that he was standing near a bend in the river, and that a tree stood on the riverbank. Frank, his wife, and the independent witness made their way to the tree and began to dig at its roots, not truly believing that they would find anything, but at the same time hoping that they did, and that it would blow Pat McAdam's investigation wide open. They did find something, partly buried under the tree and entangled in its roots. A black dress, a nylon stocking, and fragments of what could have been a patent leather handbag, all of which were torn and weathered. On a map, this area was between Annan and Lockerbie. Having found these items of clothing, but not Pat's body, Frank, having already put together a dossier of his findings, including transcripts of his visits to Gerard and photographs taken, requested a meeting with Chief Superintendent Alex Stenhouse, the Deputy Chief Constable of Dumfries and Galloway, where he handed over his dossier and told him about his visit to Gerard and his find under the roots of a tree between Lockerbie and Annan. Immediately, 2 CID officers accompanied Frank back to the exact area of his find, and a full search of the banks of the river were organised and undertaken, in the hope of also finding Pat's body. Meanwhile, the dress, the stocking, and what could have been the remains of a black patent leather bag were examined by experts. Frank really hoped that the clues he had uncovered, with the help of Gerard Croiset, would lead to Pat McAdam's disappearance being solved. The story of Frank's visit to Clairvoyant Gerard Croiset and the discovery of the torn and weathered black dress, stocking, and what could have been parts of a black patent leather bag were disclosed in the Daily Record by Frank Ryan on Monday the 16th of February. However, the next day, an article in The Scotsman stated that Mrs. McAdam had been asked to identify if a long-sleeved grey cotton dress recently found on the banks of the River Milk, along with a stocking and remains of what could be a handbag, could have been worn by Pat at the time she went missing, with Mrs. McAdam apparently saying that without even looking at the dress, she knew it couldn't be Pat's, as Pat had been wearing a black cocktail dress when she disappeared. Now, I usually take a lot of my research from the Scotsman newspapers, so I was a bit disappointed to not only see that they had misreported the dress that had been discovered as being grey and not black, but also reporting that Mrs. McAdam would even need to identify if this apparent grey dress could have been what Pat was wearing when she went missing, as we all know that Pat was wearing a black cocktail dress when she went missing. This was the only time that it was mentioned that the dress found was grey. Every other time it was black. It was also mentioned in this same Scotsman article, again for the first and only time, that the grey or black dress, stocking and possible black bag parts were found in a wooded area instead of in the banks of the River Milk. So I'm not sure what whoever wrote this particular article for the Scotsman was trying to do, whether they just picked up the information wrong or had been given the wrong information. But like I said, this was the only time this very different information was reported on. Bit strange. But it just goes to show how wrong information in newspapers could so easily become gospel many, many years later if the correct information isn't out there as well. So, according to the article written by Frank Ryan on the 16th of February and another article in the Daily Record on the 17th of February, Pat's mum, Mary McAdam, actually said, "I really wanted to get in touch with this clairvoyant myself, but couldn't get over to Holland. And that, I always keep hoping that Pat is still alive. It's horrible to think her body may be lying buried, but if she is dead, I'd rather know now. It also reported that she had been shown a picture of the black dress that had been found in the tree roots, but that she was sure it was not her daughter's. So this is the main reason I think journalist Frank Ryan did an exceptional job in keeping Pat's story in the public mind, not by misinformation or by hounding her grieving family, but by actually trying to further the investigation, being proactive and doing something that her family had wanted to do themselves but had been out of their reach. This man appeared to really care about the case and Pat's family, and it looks like Pat's family really appreciated his help and in giving them continued hope for a resolution either way. Frank Ryan, who was a long-time journalist for the Daily Record, dedicating his life work to stories from the Dumfries and Galloway region, and being the first reporter on the scene at the Lockerbie disaster and been very well known for his coverage of this disaster, died at the age of 82 on the 28th of March 2013. Now that wasn't the end of the input from Gerard Croiset. His input went on until the beginning of March 1970, being interviewed for hours at a time again and again by reporters from the Daily Record, who tried to squeeze as much information from him as they could to try and keep Pat's case from going cold, which ultimately culminated in Gerard visiting Scotland for the first time. So following Frank Ryan visiting Clairvoyant, Gerard Croiset, and him pinpointing where what Gerard thought was Pat's clothing and potentially Pat's body would be found, and Frank finding said clothing but no body, and informing the police and a search being underway, Frank's colleague Terry Houston visited Gerard again on the 17th of February in the hope of being able to pin down the area where Pat's body may be. During a 90-minute discussion, Gerard said, "There will not be much of the body left. 3 years is a long time, and it will have decomposed. I think it has been in the water or something. It will be difficult to find." Before he then, using an Ordnance Survey map, marked 2 spots with crosses where he felt Pat's body may be. According to the article, one spot was a copse of trees that were located not far from the area at the bend of the River Milk, where the black dress, stocking and possible remains of a bag were found. The second spot Gerard had marked a cross at was close to the bridge he had previously pinpointed for Frank Ryan. The interview ended with Gerard saying, "I need all pictures and lots of details from someone who knows the area well if I'm to find this girl's body." 2 days later, on the 19th of February, Frank Ryan was back at Gerard's home, and he interviewed Gerard for 2 hours, where it was reported that Gerard helped even further narrow down where police should be searching for Pat's body. In this 2-hour interview, Gerard again reiterated via an interpreter that, "I am certain the girl is dead," this time adding that she had been murdered. He then went on to say that, "I have had a vision of her getting out of a lorry with the driver on the day she disappeared. They went for a walk together." He then pointed to a hill near Middleshaw, about a 12-minute drive north of Annan, and said, "Something happened here," going on to further narrow down the search area by indicating 2 spots where police should concentrate their search, one opposite a cottage and the other near a footbridge, adding that trees have been felled there recently. The girl's body is near there, I think. 4 days later, there is another report in the Daily Record from Frank Ryan, with more information that he has received from speaking to Gerard Croiset. This time it involved a car and a summer house. Gerard had apparently done another detailed sketch, this time of a car, going as far as indicating on a map where this car had once been parked, which was at a garage yard in the south of Scotland. He also spoke of a summer house which was located near the sea in the same area as the garage yard, saying that this car has a connection with the case, so has the summer house. If the police could find them, it could help their inquiries. Frank discovered that there indeed was a garage similar to the one Gerard had described and near the spot he had indicated on the map, and that cars had been parked there for years, and that there was indeed a summer house that matched Gerard's description nearby too. Frank said he also told Gerard that police were certain that the dress he had found on the riverbank under the roots of the tree, where Gerard said he would find this, was not the one Pat had been wearing when she vanished. with tests later proving conclusively that neither the dress or the stocking had been worn by Pat, to which Gerard replied, "I got a very strong mental picture of this dress. Is it possible she bought it and was carrying it with her?" Remember though what I said in part 1, that it had been reported that Pat had only bought in Glasgow a black leather patent bag. There had been no mention of her buying a black dress, only that she'd been wearing a black cocktail dress. Also during this 2-hour interview, Frank Ryan reported that Gerard had also given him the description of a man who Gerard apparently said could help police with their inquiries into Pat's case. Gerard said this man is between 32 and 34, 5 feet 4 inches tall, with dark hair, and that his right ear is bigger than his left. All of this information was passed on to Chief Superintendent Alexander Stenhouse, and it was reported that senior police officials were studying the clues given, with a statement later being made by Chief Superintendent Alexander Stenhouse that said, "There have not, so far, been any positive developments in inquiries being made on the material the Daily Record has been good enough to make available. These inquiries will continue. Any further suggestions from the same source will receive due consideration." So it would appear that the police were willing to entertain and act on what Gerard Croiset had to say thus far. But would any of this information lead anywhere? Well, it definitely started off a discussion around clairvoyance, with an article in the Daily Record on the 17th of February 1970 asking if you could really see the future or the past of a complete stranger. But it appeared the writer definitely thought this was possible when they started the article by talking about the incredible performance by Gerard Croiset concerning missing girl Pat McAdam, and that what he had done in general belongs almost in the realms of science fiction. The article went on to state that Scotland, and particularly the Highlands and the Western Isles, had more than its quota of those who claim to have visited the past and the future. Going on to say, though, that it is almost impossible, even for experts, to explain precisely what is the strength of clairvoyance, second sight, or sixth sense, and that despite Professor John Beloff and his team at the Department of Psychology at Edinburgh University having carried out a study of extrasensory perception for 6 years, which included testing hundreds of people who claimed to have special psychic powers with sealed envelopes and laboratory checks using numbers and symbols, there is still no conclusive proof, with not one man or woman having emerged as an outstanding example. But Professor Beloff did go on to say that the work of Gerard Croiset is most fascinating, and he is convinced that Gerard has an extraordinary and uncanny ability, backing this up by saying Croiset has told police to dredge canals in certain places on certain days and bodies have been found, and that, without even having the stimulus of having belongings in his hand, he has been telephoned from America, he has been able to offer clues during fruitless investigations by the police. Professor Beloff believes that the mind of a sensitive or a clairvoyant is something which cannot be consciously controlled. Sometimes it will react to stimulus and other times it will not. It is felt that this, and the fact that genuine clairvoyants can sometimes make wildly wrong assertions, make the study even more confusing, which will continue until scientists are able to somehow pin down the workings of the human mind. So that was in 1967 that discussion was taking place, but that's not where it started. Apparently, the idea of clairvoyance started, according to an article in the Daily Record on the 15th of March 1994 in, you'll never guess where, Scotland, back in 1822. Apparently, a man called Edward Irving, who was a firebrand preacher, talked to his congregation about how he experienced miracles and that he spoke in tongues, which apparently became the basis for the spiritualist movement. I'm going to leave that there for now, but I will pick this back up in a later episode, mainly because Pat McAdam's case has become one of the most celebrated cases of the psychic detectives, and I'm interested to hear what you think about that once I've finished telling you about Gerard Croiset's involvement in the case. Okay, so Gerard was not willing to give up on trying to help find Pat McAdam's body just yet, despite his clues so far leading nowhere. And so on the 1st of March 1970, Gerard Croiset arrived in Scotland for the first time, where he was then taken to the areas which he had pinpointed from his home by head of Dumfries CID, Detective Inspector Angus Irving. Gerard spent 4 hours at the various scenes between Lockerbie and Annan before finally repeating again that Pat had been murdered by a man who had later thrown her body into the River Milk. But he went on to say that her body had initially become lodged at 2 or more points along the river before eventually being swept out to sea. And that was Gerard Croiset's final involvement in Pat McAdam's case. Now imagine everyone's surprise 2 years later when a girl's body was found in a field between Annan and Lockerbie, less than a mile from where Pat had last been seen alive. Could this be Pat McAdam? And if not, then did the police have another murder hunt on their hands? Well, in short, the answer is no and no. But let me tell you the story. But again, there are differences about the story between different newspaper articles. So, according to the Daily Record, on the 22nd of January 1972, a shooting party had been out, and upon walking over a grassy waste area on Kilmount Estate, they came across a body lying in the long grass, with the gamekeeper who was with the party saying, "As far as I could see, it was the body of a young woman with auburn hair." Apparently, a green handbag and a small blue case was found beside the body. However, according to an article in the Daily Express, also on the 22nd of January, a skeleton of a girl had been found in a willow copse, and that there was a crucifix around her neck, that the only sign of clothing was a head square and a bra, and that a handbag had been found not far away. And then an article in The Scotsman, also on the 22nd of January, read that the remains of a woman's body had been found in a snipe bog near Annan, that the remains were lying hidden amongst waist-high reeds by the sides of a stream, 100 yards and metres from the Annan to Lockerbie Road, and about 5 miles or 8 kilometres away from where Gerard Croiset had said that Pat's body had been buried. So a few discrepancies, but we get the gist. Chief Superintendent Alexander Stenhouse apparently visited Pat's mum, Mary, at her work about 5 hours after the body had been found to tell her that there was nothing identifiable found with the body, so he was unable to say if there was any connection to Pat at that moment, but that he would keep her updated once a post-mortem had been carried out. Thankfully, Mary wouldn't have to wait long, as the post-mortem was concluded later that same evening, and Mary was immediately told that the remains were not that of her daughter, Pat. In fact, the remains were of a middle-aged woman, who was thought to have been dead between 6 months and 1 year. It was also confirmed that there were no signs of foul play, but that there was very little prospect of establishing the cause of death. So a full description of this lady and her clothing and possessions were circulated to police stations all over the UK to try and find out who this lady was, if she had been reported missing, and the description was thus. She had brown hair, was about 5 foot 5 inches tall, was wearing a paisley patterned head square, leatherette coat with red lining, orange coloured dress, white underslip, dark blue gloves, and blue slingback sandals. She also was wearing a plain gold wedding ring, a gold wristlet watch, and a heart-shaped gold locket on a thin gold chain. In her possessions, she had a multicoloured umbrella, a black shopping bag with knitting, and a brown handbag which contained a 1971 diary, a cosmetic bag, and a purse with paper money and decimal coinage. Apparently there were entries in her diary, but not since May 1971, and this was now January 1972, and so her diary was no help in identifying who this lady was. She obviously didn't have any other form of identification on her person either, as police at this point had no idea who this lady was. Sadly, it was unable to be determined how old this lady was. But what I'm baffled about is why this lady would have been walking across a field, whether it be grassy wasteland, a willow copse or a bog, wearing slingback sandals and being, what it seems, dressed to the nines, with a shopping bag with knitting in it, and there being no foul play involved. This lady's badly weathered and tattered clothes were minutely searched in case they harboured any clues, and the partial upper denture that she wore was checked with dentists, as were opticians, as a pair of bifocal spectacles with brown frames were found beside her body. Now, despite me searching newspapers for weeks and months after this, nothing else was reported about this woman, about who this woman was and if she had been reported missing and her family informed, which was pretty disappointing. However, I did find an article in the Scottish Daily Express on the 15th of January 2023 that listed the 22 bodies in Scotland that have never been identified by police, which includes a body that had been found in 1971 that had still not been identified. As this lady's body was found in 1972 and didn't appear on this list, I have to assume that she eventually was identified and her family informed. At least that's what I hope, and that she hasn't simply slipped through the cracks in the intervening years. If you remember this lady being found, maybe you remember the outcome. It would be great to know for sure. Okay, so back to Pat. After the January 1972 discovery, Pat's case goes cold again. That is until April 1975, when it is announced, again in the Daily Record by Frank Ryan, that the BBC will be making a 45-minute programme reconstructing the disappearance of 17-year-old Pat McAdam, and that Dumfries amateur actress and secretary, 17-year-old Joanne, was to play Pat. The programme was titled The Search for Pat McAdam, and Frank Ryan himself, Gerard Croiset, and the police all contributed to the making of the programme. But the article did go on to say that the programme would mainly focus on Gerard Croiset's revelations to Frank in 1970. So, a programme about Pat's disappearance, but again hijacked by Gerard Croiset, despite none of his revelations leading anywhere. Sorry, that was most definitely my opinions coming through there. Didn't I say that was happening more and more often these days? Maybe it's an age thing. Frank also made his opinions clear in the article when he ended it with, "The case has certainly convinced me that Gerard's sixth sense is a reality. Will tonight's programme convince others?" Would it have convinced you if you had watched it? Actually, does anyone remember watching this? And if so, what were your thoughts after watching it? I've not been able to find it to watch it myself. Frank also touched lightly on the topic of missing people in Scotland in this article. How apparently hundreds of young girls had gone missing in Scotland every year, how he would cover many of such stories, but that he never could have guessed that the story of missing Pat McAdam would be so very different. On the back of this, I found an interesting article from September 1967, again from the Daily Record, where the article stated that it was over 10,000 Scots that would disappear from home every year, and how Pat's disappearance had initially started just like that, another missing person case. So a big difference in the number of missing person cases per year in Scotland. Was it only hundreds of girls that went missing every year out of the over 10,000 in total reported every year in Scotland? Or was 10,000 a much overestimation? 10,000 people being reported missing each year in Scotland, male or female, seems a hell of a lot to me. Hundreds maybe would have been my guess. So obviously, I had to do a wee bit of research, and I found an article from the Scotsman on the 12th of January 2016 that said that nearly 90 Scots are reported missing every day, and that more than 37,000 missing person reports are made in Scotland every single year. Well, my guess was very wrong. That's a lot of families in Scotland alone affected by a missing family member. Thankfully, the article went on to say that 99% of those who vanished do return safe and well, but that still left, at the time of the 2016 article, more than 600 missing person cases open in Scotland, classed as long-term missing. That's a huge amount. So it looks like the over 10,000 Scots missing every year as of 1967 was way more accurate than Frank Ryan's estimate of hundreds of missing girls each year in Scotland. Speaking of missing person cases, in 1975, despite 8 years having passed, and Gerard Croiset saying that Pat had been murdered, albeit there was no evidence and Pat's body had yet to be discovered, Pat was still only classed as a missing person. All that would change though in 1977, 10 years after she disappeared, when it was reported a man was being questioned in regards to Pat McAdam's disappearance. But it wouldn't just be Pat McAdam's disappearance he was being questioned about. This was on the back of a murder trial conviction. We'll hear all about that and this man, Thomas Ross Young, in the next episode. It'd be great to hear from anyone who remembers this case. who watched the reconstruction programme, who remembers Gerard Croiset's involvement and what your thoughts were then and now on that, who remembers the unidentified lady's body being found close to where Pat had last been seen alive, who remembers anything I haven't already mentioned. Okay, so I'm going to try and get the next episode out next week. It might be a day or two late though, as my gran has booked in quite a few appointments for herself for this week and next, and guess who's the designated driver? And this will limit my writing and editing time. So please remember to subscribe so you get the episode as soon as it's released. There will still be one further episode after next week's, just to bring you up to date with everything, and of course to offer my unwanted opinions. So until next time, I've been your host, Dawn.
Scottish Murders is a production of Clairvoyant.